Hi everyone. There's a popular theory that the legend of the war between Atlantis and the nations of the Mediterranean has its origin in the historical events involving the Sea Peoples in the Late Bronze Age. So in case you don't know, the Sea Peoples were a group of nations who came from the islands and coastlands of some areas of the Mediterranean, and they engaged in devastating raids against some of the nations of the Eastern Mediterranean, particularly the Egyptians and the Hittites, and also nations between those two civilizations, such as those along the eastern coast of the Mediterranean. So some people have connected these historical events with the legend of Atlantis. In the Timaeus, we see that Plato wrote, "This vast power gathered into one endeavored to subdue at a blow our country, meaning Egypt, and yours, meaning Greece, and the whole of the region within the straits. And then, Solon, your country shone forth. And when the rest fell off from her, being compelled to stand alone, after having undergone the very extremity of danger, she defeated and triumphed over the invaders, and preserved from slavery those who were not yet subjugated, and generously liberated all the rest of us who dwell within the pillars." So according to this, it was the Greeks who finally defeated the Atlanteans and freed everyone else in the Mediterranean who were being attacked by them. The theory that there's some connection between these two events, or rather between the historical events involving the Sea Peoples and the legend of Atlantis, is based primarily on a few key facts. Firstly, one of the main groups involved in the raids of the Sea Peoples were the Sherden. They were one of the main, most prominent groups among the Sea Peoples. Now, the Sherden have been identified by the majority of scholars as the inhabitants of Bronze Age Sardinia. As well as the name being similar to Sardinia, also the way that the Egyptians depicted the Sherden matches what we see in the archaeology of Bronze Age Sardinia. Now that's important because there's also a whole case to be made that Sardinia was the real Atlantis. Now I don't agree with that, but I'll leave that for another video. Let's just go with that for now. So that means we have this interesting historical situation in which we've got inhabitants from what, let's say, is the real Atlantis, invading in large-scale raids against the Eastern Mediterranean, including specifically Egypt, which was one of the specific nations mentioned by Plato in his account of the war between Atlantis and other nations. So on the face of it, that seems like a good specific match. There's also the fact that the Sea Peoples ended up being defeated, which matches what Plato wrote in his account of Atlantis. The Atlanteans weren't successful, they ended up being defeated in the war, and their attacks on the other nations came to an end. So that fits what happened with the Sea Peoples as well. And we've also got to talk about the timing of all this, because famously Plato placed Atlantis many thousands of years in the past. He said it happened 9,000 years before the time of Solon, so in other words around about 9,600 BCE. So that obviously is a lot further back in time than the Bronze Age Sea Peoples. However, for a variety of reasons, many people have objected to this figure of 9,000 years used in Plato's account. And they argue that actually this is a mistake and the original number was much, much smaller, or there's some confusion over what it actually means. One common explanation in the context of this Sea Peoples argument is that actually these 9,000 years were really 9,000 months. So that would be equal to 750 years. So if we count back 750 years from the time of Solon in the 6th century BCE, then that would take us to the Late Bronze Age. So again, that seems to fit in very well with the events involving the Sea Peoples. You can definitely see why this is such an appealing idea. On the face of it, it does seem quite convincing. However, there are some serious problems with it. First of all, well, let's consider the point I just mentioned, the issue of time. So if we count back 750 years from the time of Solon, that takes you to the Late Bronze Age. Yes, that's true. However, it takes you much further back in time than when the Sea Peoples were active, especially the era in which the Sea Peoples were actually defeated. So when we look to Egyptian records, we see that the earliest account of the Sea Peoples actually active in warfare was the beginning of the 13th century BCE. Whereas if we count backwards 750 years from the time of Solon, that takes us about half a century earlier than that. And again, that's when we start seeing the Sea Peoples mentioned in Egyptian records. When we look to the point where they were actually most active, which was about a decade or two either side of the year 1200 BCE, then that becomes a much bigger difference, upwards of 150 years, especially if we count from the time when the Sea Peoples were actually defeated, which is the major point of Plato's account, the defeat of the Atlanteans by the Greeks. They were defeated at the Battle of the Delta in 1178, according to most chronologies. There is a big difference between that and 1340, which is the actual result we get when we consider those 9,000 years to be 9,000 months. So although it obviously does get us quite close to the events of the Sea Peoples, there's still a big issue involved there. It still doesn't match especially well. It's still just a very vague match in terms of the chronology. Then, in terms of the actual events involved, we get some far more serious issues. So remember, the point of the Atlantis story in Plato's two dialogues, Critias and Timaeus, the whole point of it is that it's a demonstration of how the Greeks were able to overcome this mighty power, the Atlanteans. That's not a little detail involved in the account. That is the fundamental reason for Plato telling the story. However, when we compare that to what happened with the Sea Peoples, it's fundamentally different. The Atlanteans were defeated by the Greeks, specifically Athens. They were not defeated by the Egyptians. That's actually a key point that's mentioned in the account. The Egyptians and others had not been able to overcome the Atlanteans, whereas the Greeks had. In the case of the Sea Peoples, it was not the Greeks who defeated them, it was the Egyptians. So that is a fundamental difference. Now you could say, okay, that's just Greek propaganda. The Greeks wanted to make themselves appear to be the victors rather than the Egyptians who actually won the war. Well, okay, you could say that, but the problem gets worse when we consider the fact that there's evidence that the Greeks were actually part of the Sea Peoples. You see, like I said, the Sea Peoples were made up of several different nations. The Sherden appear to have been the most prominent, but there were also various others. Now, two of them have been identified as Greek groups. One of them is the Ekwesh, and the other is the Denyen. The second is the most secure of the two, but both of them have, by various scholars, been identified as Greeks. So we have this situation in which there's no evidence that the Sea Peoples fought against the Greeks, but rather there's evidence that the Greeks were actually involved. They were actually part of the Sea Peoples, and they were involved in these raids. And then it was the Egyptians who ended up winning against them. So it's fundamentally different from the story of Atlantis. The Greeks were supposed to have fought alongside the Egyptians against the Atlanteans, whereas what happened with the Sea Peoples is that the Greeks were fighting alongside the Sherden, supposedly the real Atlanteans, against the Egyptians, and the Egyptians were then victorious. That is completely, fundamentally, profoundly different. So it's not plausible to connect the events of the Sea Peoples with the legend of Atlantis. Now, to be clear, I'm not one of those people who's super strict about identifying historical events with legends from centuries later. I don't demand that they're perfectly, exactly the same. I'm perfectly willing to accept, and regularly do accept, the concept of historical events becoming distorted over time, and also propaganda being involved. I'm perfectly willing to accept that, and I regularly do, as you no doubt know if you watch my channel regularly. However, the problem is simply that these two things, the story of Atlantis and the historical events of the Sea Peoples, are so fundamentally different that they are just incompatible. To me, it is completely impossible to accept this idea that the story of the Greeks winning a war against Atlantis while the Egyptians weren't able to comes from the historical activities of the Sea Peoples, in which the Greeks fought alongside them against the Egyptians and were defeated by them. To me, that is just too much of a difference to accept. In my opinion, there's a much better explanation for a historical source behind the story of the war with Atlantis, one which actually does involve the Greeks and involves them being the victors of the event. But in a future video, I'll look into that in detail. For now though, if you'd like to hear about the second Gildas of Dark Age Britain, then come back next time for my next video.